Good evening. It's good to be with you again. As a few are just finishing up their conversations, it's all right. It just goes if they don't mind being broadcast live. It's kind of all right. But it's good to be with you on a nice Sunday evening, coming into the fall. And as always, I'd like to give a bit of a review of where we're going in this series for those who are joining us for the first time. The series is called Don't Jenga Your Faith. But in actuality, later on in the future, I'm like, you could have called this better kerplunk, but I think more people are familiar with Jenga, where the idea that you take a block out and you put it on top, but you try not to knock the tower over. Kerplunk does it a little bit better, the game with the marbles and the sticks, and you keep removing sticks, and the person who removes the last stick that causes all the marbles to fall loses. Using that metaphorically here, obviously, for the things of the faith that people say, you know what, maybe I don't have to believe this, maybe I don't have to believe that, I can just slide this piece out, I can slide this one out. And eventually they wonder how their faith ends up shipwrecked when you start to remove things. And we've looked at such things, if I can remember them all, 'cause this is lesson 5 of them, lesson 5 tonight. But like the opening night was really like looking at Andy Stanley's comments on how we need to unhitch from the value system of the Old Testament, and then we saw how later on he made a comment about you can almost have to unhitch from the teaching of the New Testament. And then I think in one of his latest series now, more of an update, he says if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you only got to believe 2 things. One, that God made everything, but in Andy Stanley's view, you can take that however you want. And the only other thing you have to believe is that Jesus rose from the dead. There's actually a lot more to it, but that's all you got to believe. You can ignore everything else, as long as you believe those 2 things. And I'd argue that's actually not the case, because now you're removing everything and you don't even understand it. Because if all you got to believe is Jesus rose from the dead, then you can ask the question, why? Why did Jesus rise from the dead? What was the point of it? It wasn't just to prove that he was God. You had to go back and say, okay, why did he die? Then you got to unpack that. And so there's a lot to it. And so we looked at that. And we looked at the first block, which is really the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you start, even in that verse, to unpack who God is. And when you remove even that one verse that God created all things in the beginning, well, you lose who God is. And you start to make God in your own image. And then we touched on the fact that humanity was created in the image of God and by God, and not through a process through evolution or anything like that. Why? Because when you remove that concept, then humanity becomes almost nothing. It loses value, it loses meaning, loses purpose, because ultimately we're nothing but a mistake, and you run into that. And then the last couple we looked at the topic of sin itself, and then we talked on judgment, or God's justice, which is an important one. And tonight we're going to be jumping a little bit out of Genesis. We're going to be in Genesis, but it's not really the focus. Not everything in this series is going to be from Genesis. It's going to be from all over, because it's looking at those things that people want to remove. And tonight, before we go any further, and I give you the title for tonight, although if you look in the description you might be able to get the title for tonight. Let's just open with a word of prayer. Oh, Father God, I just thank you to be able to come together, both in person and through the use of technology, to just learn more about you, learn who you are, to learn how awesome and wonderful you are, and to see that you have revealed yourself through your word. And Father, I just thank you for your word, which reveals the truth to us. And as we look at your word tonight, I pray that you would open our eyes to it, you'd open our hearts to understand, and that ultimately the Spirit would be our teacher and remind us of those things we've already learned. And so, Father, as we study together, may your name be glorified. May your name be praised in it all. And I give you thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. So tonight, in this teaching, we're going to look at this topic, God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. Now, you may not think that that's something that people want to get away from. But you'd be surprised. It actually is. There's actually quite a bit to it. And we're going to unpack what does it mean for God to be sovereign. Ultimately, we do sing a song here every once in a while. I don't think we've done it here in a couple of months. And now if our music director suddenly throws it in next week, I'll know why. But the song is Sovereign Over Us, or Sovereign Over Me, I think is what it is. And it makes the statement that God is sovereign. And so to understand that, I'm going to give a definition. But before I do that, as always, I like to put this picture up because it gives a illustration of why you can't just throw out one teaching. And it's the buoys in the water. As I said, if you've been with me every week, you're probably getting tired of seeing this image. It's going to be engraved in your head, and every time you go to a public pool or something, you're going to think about it. That's the point. But in a buoy system such as this, you can't just go to like the third buoy and say, you know what, I'm going to sink that third buoy and nothing else. Because as soon as you pull down one of those buoys, it's going to pull down the others. It's going to pull them under as well. And so it's going to affect everything in the line. And so when you get rid of one of these teachings and one of these doctrines, you're not just going to get rid of something you don't like. It's going to affect everything else, and you're going to have to try to explain why certain things. One of the teachings that we haven't touched on, but we will be the substitutionary atonement. In other words, Jesus' death as the payment for sin. And there actually is a school of thought which is out there that says, no, Jesus didn't die for our sins. In fact, Jesus didn't really have to die. And then you go, okay, then why did Jesus die? And they've got to offer this explanation, and the explanation was, well, God was tired of the sacrificial system, so he said, I'm going to give you a sacrifice that you can't beat, so you'll stop all this other stuff. That's literally the explanation for it. I've dumbed it down, but that's the gist of it. And so it works out so much better when you leave the teaching as it is. That doesn't mean we don't struggle with them. As we talked with God's justice last week, it doesn't mean there's not going to be times you're going to go, I don't like this, I don't really understand it. That's not necessarily the problem. It just means don't get rid of it. Continue to study, to continue to learn in it. And so tonight, we're dealing with sovereignty. So I'm going to define it like this. That he has the power, the wisdom, and the authority to do anything he chooses within his creation. He has the power, the wisdom, and authority to do anything he chooses within his creation. Now, if you think people won't have a problem with that, I'm going to drop back again to last week to God's justice, just for a second. And people really don't want to grasp this concept, that God can do anything he wants with the creation. And the reason being is because in God's justice, when God ordered the Israelites to attack the city of Jericho, he gave them very specific instructions to wipe out everything. And you can't avoid it. That means he killed every animal, every man, every woman, every child. And then people are like, well, that's just not right. You can't do that. Yet, if you understand a concept like sovereignty, then yeah, you can. It's his. To put another term, let's say I go out and I buy a brand new car. Absolutely brand new, right off the lot. And I decide I'm going to lend it to Jeff. And I imagine if I lend it to Jeff, Jeff's first he's going to get in, he's going to enjoy the car. He's going to go, oh, this is kind of nice, a little too fancy for me, because Jeff goes for the bare bones cars. Jeff wants none of the bells and whistles. Jeff would still do the roll down windows. He wants none of that. He wants the crank windows and all that. But he'd be like, this is a nice car. And he would take care of it. I guarantee Jeff would take care of it to the T. And then just imagine he brings it back, and as soon as he brings it back to me, I decide to light the car on fire and burn it to the ground. Now he may go, what on earth are you doing? But in reality, if I bought the car and I paid for it, it's mine to do with as I see fit. You may not agree with it that I did that. You may think that was a waste, but in essence, I'm sovereign over that car. And so when we're looking at God's sovereignty, you can begin to see, now that was just an extreme example, I wouldn't actually do that. But you can see why people are like, maybe I don't like the fact that God is sovereign. And there's even more to it than that. And the argument goes far deeper than this. And we're going to touch on it a little bit later. But it's this idea that God can do anything. And the scriptures back this up. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. That means every person, every animal, every tree, every rock, every fish, every bird, everything belongs to Him. But with that, and with the other characteristics of God, I don't think this is the issue that we're really going to have. The real question I think we're going to struggle with, not that one, is this. To what extent does God apply His sovereignty? Think about that for a second. If God is completely sovereign over absolutely everything, where does free will fall in? Does that mean God is now responsible for evil? Does that mean God is responsible for flooding that leads to the death of hundreds of people? Was God responsible for the tsunami that hit Japan not quite a decade ago, probably 7-8 years ago? Is God responsible for these things? Was God responsible for the world wars? Was God responsible for the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime? If God is sovereign over all of this, how do we understand that? And so the question comes back to what extent does God actually apply His sovereignty? He has the right, authority, wisdom, and power to do whatever He wants with what is His. Which means if God so chose to wipe everything out, He was in His right. If God chose to keep everything going, that's in His right as well. But knowing God's character, that He's eternally good, holy, and just, where does He live? Why doesn't He just execute all this? It's a question that was asked a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about sin, but the just ghost, it's a question that's always asked. I'm going to ask it even back further because we were dealing with humanity sin. But if God knew that Lucifer was going to rebel, then why did He bother to create him in the first place? Knowing all the problems that he was going to cause. Couldn't He have still created humanity with the tree of knowledge of good and evil without the need for Lucifer? And still given humanity the choice? Yet God allowed it. So when we're dealing with sovereignty of God, I think this is the real question. To what extent does He apply His sovereignty? Because if we hold that everything is God's, then, and God is in control of everything, then we're going to have to wrestle with this. And I think it's a good thing to wrestle with. And for this, there's a truth, and to understand this, I'm going to go to Isaiah 46, verse 9 and 10. And again, for the people in person, the reason I always encourage you, because it's going to get a little small to see on the screen, but it's better for the at-home people for this. But Isaiah 46, verse 9 and 10. I keep wanting to invert that. And it's God speaking. And He says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." And then it gives some examples. "Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it." So this is a case where you notice He's saying that thing, I declare the end from the beginning. In other words, He knows all that's going to happen. He is in control of it all. Which does leave us with the issue to wrestle with, that if that's the case, then why doesn't God prevent certain disasters from happening? Why doesn't God stop an earthquake? Why doesn't God stop a storm that comes in and does damage and takes lives? Does He have the power? Sure. Jesus demonstrated this when He was showing the disciples evidence of who He was. when he woke up and he just told the storm to be calm. And the disciples asked the question, who is this that even the wind and the waves can obey him? He was demonstrating his divine power. And so how can God allow this? And there's a concept in this that we've got to understand. Since everything becomes God's will, there's an aspect to it that we have to understand, and it's called God's permissive will. It's where, although God is in command of all things, he allows certain things to take place, which and ultimately he can use for his glory later. I remember when I was dealing with this topic last year with the youth group. And the question is that I proposed to them, did God create evil? Because the logic is, God created everything. Evil exists. There's no denying that. Unless you want to deny the Creator. You want to play somebody like a Buddhist where everything is an illusion. Or if you want to play the naturalist where there is no such thing as good or evil, there's just indifference to it all. And for that, you can look at a couple of them, like Richard Dawkins even admit that in his writings. So since there's evil, it's like, if God created him, did he create evil? And it was interesting to watch the youth just wrestle with this issue. And try to come with it. And something like, well, if God created everything, then yeah, I guess he did. And then the others are like, no. It's like, well, he's like, no, I don't think God created evil. It's like, well, then did God create everything? Like, well, and they would struggle with it. That's a good thing to struggle with. And then there was one who you could tell he was thinking about it for quite a while. And he asked, okay, what do you think? And he goes, I don't think God created evil. I just think he created the opportunity for it to exist. In other words, instead of creating it, he gave the opportunity, he created a space for it to allow. And that's what we would call God's permissive will. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. I'm going to give you some examples to understand this. And to see some examples, I guess I'll throw that there. The examples of permissive will. We're not going to read all of these, because obviously you look there, Genesis 37 to 50, that would take me your entire time to read that. But 1 Samuel chapter 8 is a pretty good example. Understand the background of 1 Samuel at this point. The book of Samuel starts at the end of the time of the judges. And at the time of the judges, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And Israel was governed by a series of judges. Not necessarily chronologically, but each tribe seemed to have somebody over them, or tribes up. And as time was coming and the judges came to a close, the last judge was Samuel, the prophet Samuel. And Samuel was now up in age. He was nearing the end of his lifespan, if you want that. And his sons were not doing what was right. We'll put it that way. And so the people said, your sons aren't fit. And they say, give us a king. And that's what Samuel is wrestling with. And so we're going to pick this up a little bit. So starting in verse 1, Samuel chapter 8, 1 Samuel chapter 8. It says, now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. Now remember, the reason Israel was unique, they were designed to have a theocracy, where God is their king. And the judges were operating in the name of God. And so that was what was supposed to happen. Israel was supposed to be different. They were supposed to be God's chosen people. They were uniquely supposed to follow God. But now they're saying, we want to be like everyone else. Now notice what God says here. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Now this is a unique event, because if you look back in Israel's history before this point, any time that the Israelites disobeyed God, be it complaining, be it rejecting him, being it making a golden calf, God punished them. And he did it in a variety of ways. Did it by serpents, did it by plagues, and he punished them anytime they disobeyed. But here you've got a thing where they're flat out rejecting God. And God's saying that. But instead, does God punish them this time in this case? No. He gives them exactly what they asked for. What's even fascinating by this is God knew this was going to happen. You go back and you read the instructions in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Particularly in Deuteronomy, it talks about what to do when they demand a king. He knew exactly that it was going to happen. So if this was considered a wicked thing of them rejecting him, why did he allow it? This is what we call God's permissive will. Now the other two I'm not going to read, but I'll give you the quick rundown. Job. Job 1 and 2, this is a guy, it gives you a picture of the heavenly council of God, and the angels come in, and along comes with them is the accuser, the Satan, and he comes in. It's a very fascinating conversation, because it wasn't the Satan walking in and saying, hey, I want to do something about Job. It was God going, hey, have you considered my servant Job? And he's like, there's no one like him. And that opened the door for Satan to step in. And the first time, God says, okay, you can do whatever you want, but you can't touch him. And if I asked you, who struck Job? You'd say Satan did. But God, when Satan comes back, God says, you enticed me to strike everything he owns. So in other words, God allowed it. Satan did the work, but it's still within the will of God. And then Satan was allowed to come back. He says, well, skin for skin, he'll curse you his face. He'll do anything to save himself. And God said, okay, you can do everything you want except one thing. You cannot kill him. So God allowed it. So that's what you see in Job 1 and 2. So you've got an example of God's permissive will. Now, Genesis 37 to 50, this is the events of Joseph. Now, in Joseph's case, you take a look at it from the very beginning, when we're introduced to Joseph. Our whole introduction to Joseph, he's the firstborn of Rachel. Isaac loves him because Rachel was his favorite. The firstborn son, he shows undue favoritism towards Joseph, gives Joseph a robe of many colors. But Joseph also ends up having a couple of dreams. If you remember, he has the dream of the sheaves in the fields. He says, we were collecting sheaves of green. My sheaves stood up, and all yours bowed down to me. And the brothers knew what that meant. He said, you think we're going to bow down to you, are we? And that one went. And next time he has a dream, he says, I remember seeing the sun and the moon and 12 stars bowing down to me. And his father knew what it meant. It's like, you think your mother and I are going to bow down to you? Joseph was told that this is what was going to happen. But from that point on, when Joseph was coming out to them in the fields under his father's request to check on them, what do they say? Well, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dream. And of course, events take place where Reuben convinces him, let's not kill him, let's throw him into a pit. Murder is bad because Reuben wants to save him. Judah, on the other hand, when Reuben goes away, sees this and goes, no, let's not kill him, let's make some money off him, sells him off to some Ishmaelite traders. Joseph ends up in Egypt, ends up working for Potiphar, raises through the ranks of Potiphar's house, gets falsely accused of attempted rape on Potiphar's wife, ends up in jail, and then eventually from there the events take place where he interprets Pharaoh's dream. I'm summarizing here, obviously. Interprets Pharaoh's dream and gets made a ruler in Egypt, which eventually led his brothers, because of a famine now takes place, to come and bow down, fulfilling the dream. In each one of these cases, you see God's permissive will at work. And the nice thing about this is in each of these three cases, we can see the outcome. We're far enough in history we can see it. Because of the reign of kings, what did that lead to? The prophecy that God had spoken. Go back and read the end of Genesis, where Isaac is blessing his children. And in Judah's case, he's told that the scepter will never depart from Judah. And then as time goes on and the prophecies come out, the Messiah comes from the line of David, from the tribe of Judah. And he will be king. So we see the long-term game of that. In Job, what you see is, in this event, in the events of Job, it helps us to deal with the topic of suffering. It's called wisdom literature, and there's lots of discussion in Job. And in the end, one of the topics of it is God's sovereignty even in it, because Job says, I would question God. And then in the end, when God finally shows up, God doesn't answer any of Job's questions. He just nails him with question after question after question after question. To put it in perspective, and Job's response at the end was, I covered my mouth, I spoke when I shouldn't have. I didn't know what I was talking about. And so we see God's sovereignty even through all of that. And then in Genesis' case, in Joseph's case, Joseph here actually tells us the end game. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. And because of all this happened, he says, I was able to save all of you. And so even here, when we're seeing God's permissive will, we're starting to unpack one of the doctrines that would go with it, and that becomes the hope that we can have, that because God is in control of all these things, he can use them for his good. Isn't that one of the promises in the book of Romans that people love to claim? All things work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purposes. That's because it's all within his permissive will. A great example from the New Testament, and the ultimate example is everything that Jesus went through, prophesied through Isaiah, the suffering servant. And they constantly said, if you could, it's like, if you really are the Son of God, stop this. Come down from this. Put an end to it. He willfully allowed it all to take place to accomplish the ultimate good. That's God's sovereignty. It really is. And in the end, and I love this aspect, is really people don't like God's sovereignty because there's a true extreme to it. And this is one of the things, I don't have to talk about this, but this would be where you'd run into the Calvinist versus Arminian debate. And we're going to go to Romans 9 for this. Where, if you understand, and again, I'm going to be really summarizing here. There's a lot more to it. In the Calvinist, in the extreme Calvinist position, God, in his sovereignty, controls everything, and he knows everything. So everything that takes place, everybody who's born, it's already been written out for them. And so every decision that they make, God knows who's going to be his. God causes it to happen. So therefore, by definition, this is one of the complaints we would have against the extreme Calvinism, is that therefore God has predestined people to life, and God has predestined people to eternal destruction. And they're like, well, that's just predestined. Now, in reality, does God have the right for that? Yeah, he does. Because it's his to begin with. And obviously you get the other extreme examples here of Arminianism, where the idea is that, no, humanity has complete autonomy, and God abides by humanity's autonomy in that aspect. But let's look at Romans 9 here, because Paul is dealing with this a little bit, and Romans 9 is a book on salvation. And Romans 9, verse 14. Notice what he says. He says, what shall we say then? So he's talking about God's selection of Israel to do a task. He says, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. So then it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to the Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills, he hardens. I'm going to pause there for a second. Now, Pharaoh is an interesting case, because according to this statement, he's quoting the scriptures, God says, Pharaoh, I've raised you up for this very purpose. To do what? To bring judgment against Egypt. To bring judgment against Egypt's gods, to bring it down, and to show his power. So what say did Pharaoh have in this? Kind of the question you can ask. And when you look, so it says he will harden. And how many times, if you read the account of the Exodus, that it says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So it's like, was Pharaoh to blame? Now it's interesting that Paul's going to sidestep that question. Here's why. Let's continue. Verse 19. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? So that's the question. I think it's a fair question, but here's the answer he gives. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay? From the same lump to one make one vessel for honor and to another for dishonor? What if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory? Even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. Notice Paul, basically he's doing the exact same thing that God did to Job. Instead of trying to get into this philosophical argument, he cuts right to the heart of the matter and goes, who are you? Who are you to question the Creator? Who are you to question God? Because that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to this idea that, you know what, I know better than God. I'm the one who should be making the decisions. In any of these cases. And Paul's like, I'm not even getting into these. He's going to cut right to it. Who are you, oh man, to reply against God? Because when Job tried it and God just came and asked him questions, he was silenced. Isn't it interesting in the end that when they continued to ask Jesus questions and they continued to challenge him, all he had to do to really silence them was ask them a question back? That's all he really did. And they were like, whose authority do you have all this? And in the end he was like, well, I'll answer your question, you answer mine. John's baptism, from man or from God? And they realized they couldn't answer the question that would get them out of trouble. And they said, we don't know. It's like, then I'm not going to tell you. You have no right to continue to challenge this. It's not the only time Jesus did this. Jesus would ask them a question, and it says, and they silenced them. And the people were amazed. Because I think one of the major problems we have is a sense of overinflated self-worth to the point that we think we're God. That God, you answer to me. And so when we run into it, I think that's what causes us to be taken aback. That God truly is sovereign. And that's what Paul was getting at here. That even if God predestined some to glory, and he put up with the vessels of wrath in the end to show his power, you have no right really to challenge that. You're the Creator. And look at the level that he brings humanity down to. He says, does the thing formed say to him who formed it, Why have you made me like this? And now look what it says, does not the potter have the power over the clay? I don't think that's a random thing that he just made up. What was man created from? The clay. In this case, the dust. It's like, you're the clay. Do you, as the potter, when you make something, say, allow the clay to tell you that it's going to, I don't want to be this? It's like, no, you shape it for whatever you want to shape it. If you make something that's used for refuse, that's the way it is. If you use something for cooking, that's the way it is. You don't go, oh, wait, what does the pot think it should be? It's like, and that's the same way. That God is the potter. And he can do with what he wills. And as I said, this is a part where people kind of really kick back against it. And so what you have here, and I haven't used the other term yet, but I will now, is an example of what you can call God's prescriptive will. Where God says, this is what's going to happen. And it will happen. Take, for example, Judas. It says he was created for the exact purpose to do the job that he did. And so Pharaoh is one. He's like, you were raised up for this exact moment. When God says this is what's going to happen, that's what will happen. One of the questions I always love to try to work with is the Apostle Peter. The second Jesus told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times this night before the cock crows, did Peter now have the choice? Because if Peter didn't do it, what did he just do? Prove Jesus wrong. But at the end, he did it. So it's like, should you blame Peter for it? That's the question that Paul was dealing with there. He bypasses it. I'm gonna go where he bypassed for tonight. I'm going to handle that kind of question, but I'm not going to use Peter for it. I'm going to use one of my favorite spots to go to understand God's prescriptive will versus his permissive will. And it's in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 25. Because I think it's a full display of God's sovereignty. Genesis 25, 19 to 34. Now, here we are. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his plea. And Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be greater than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. I'm going to pause there for a second. What have these children done yet? Not a thing. They're in the womb. They haven't even seen the light of day. Yet from the very beginning, what has God prescribed? That the older will serve the younger. That's what he's prescribed. He says, this is what will take place. And he says the 2 are going to struggle against each other, but the younger will be victorious. Keep that in mind. God prescribes this. Let's just deal with their birth, and then we'll go to the next section in a second. It says, so when their days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterwards his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, deals with the birth. So now we've got their names. That's the only person behind that. Esau is the oldest. Jacob is the younger. And it's already been prophesied that Esau is going to be subservient to Jacob. So the question is, does Esau have a choice here? Does Jacob have a choice here, because this is God's prescriptive will. Let's get to the second part of this event. Verse 29. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I am about to die, so what is the birthright to me?" Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and a stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Did God force Esau to do this? Not at all. This was Esau's choice. Notice even in the event of Peter, it seems that Peter forgot that Jesus said, "Before this night is over, you will deny me 3 times." He remembered after it was done. So Peter did do such a thing. In other words, it seems that with God's prescriptive and permissive will, even in the realm of his permissive will, it's fulfilling his prescriptive will. And I've always said this, humanity's free will never infringe on the sovereignty of God. Even in humanity's free will, even in his rebellion, even in his rejection, it will accomplish God's perfect sovereign will. And therefore, humanity is not excused from the consequences of their actions, even though God knew what was going to happen. He knows what's happening. He allows it to take place because it will ultimately fulfill something more. Do we always know what it is? The answer is no. We don't. We don't always know what the eternal outcome is going to be. This is where there is an issue of faith and trust. This is why it's so important to know the other characteristics of God. That God is love, that God is good, that God is just, that he is holy. Because therefore we put our faith in him. And therefore when something takes place, it doesn't mean we have to enjoy it. I'm pretty sure that Joseph, when he was being dragged out of the pit, he might have first thought this was a good thing. But then they dragged him over to the slave traders. Do you think he's sitting there rejoicing, saying, "Hey, all is well. I know this is going to..." No, he's probably kicking and screaming the entire time. And then when he's falsely accused of sexually assaulting Potiphar's wife, do you think he's standing there, "Well, this is all good"? He's probably putting up an argument. He probably is telling Potiphar, "Look, I've served you all this time. I haven't done any of this." And yet he still ended up in prison. And even there, you can kind of see, if you pay attention to it, that Joseph in prison is trying to get out. Because even when he interprets the baker and the cupbearer's dreams, he tells the cupbearer, "When you get out of here, tell Pharaoh about my case. Get me out of this." And yet he was still there for a couple of years. But in the end, Joseph looks back and he says, that all had to happen. It put me in the right place at the right time to accomplish what God had set in motion. Because God was aware of the famine that was going to take place. Everything that took place, even though it is by humanity's free will, it's still aligned with God's perfect will. And when, as I said, you look at the ministry of Jesus, near the end of it, where Judas betrayed him. Judas did that of his own will. And you can come up with reasons why he did it, why he chose it. And the most logical explanation is that Joseph was a member of the group of, or it's not Joseph, Judas was a member of the Essene group who were more radicals, that he would actually maybe thinking that he's trying to kick off a rebellion, force Jesus to be a warrior king, but that wasn't the plan. And when everything that they did, and it's fascinating, when you read Psalm 22 that Jesus starts to quote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When you read through that psalm, the people who are there, they're crying out to Jesus like he saved himself, called down from there, jeering at him. They were fulfilling Psalm 22. Everything that they did when they gave him hyssop, wine vinegar to drink, they fulfilled Psalm 22. They weren't aware of that, but that's exactly what they were doing. And so this is an example of God's perfect sovereignty at work. And then even if, then this is what Paul was going to get in discussion, even if you want to get into the argument saying that God has foreordained every single event, he has the right to. He has the right to. It's his. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And this is why when you throw it even from the very beginning that God is the creator of all things, if you try to get rid of that, then you lose that that everything belongs to him. But it does. And so when God, in his wisdom and in his sovereignty, decides, you know what, I'm going to wipe out everything, but I'm going to start over again with this particular family, he has the right to. When God brings down destruction and executes his justice, he has a right to. When at the end, when Peter puts it that everything's going to be consumed by fire, God has the right to, because it's his. But humanity, even if it wants to argue that, well, since God is all-knowing and that he prescribes everything, well, then why is it my fault? The funny thing is, this is intrinsically known that people want to use this argument. Go back to one of the early arguments that the LGBTQ used in their justification for their lifestyle. It was always, I was born this way. What are they trying to do? They're trying to say, it's not my fault. God caused it. That's ultimately what they want to argue, even if they don't want to say it that way. And ultimately, that's what we want to pass the responsibility to another, and we can't do that. When it came to God talking in his prescriptive will about Jacob and Esau, you then see immediately the next event that's covered is Esau fulfilling exactly those things. And we have no indication that Rebekah ever told Jacob that that was what was going to happen. In fact, you can almost think that the evidence shows that she didn't tell him this. Or else you'd think he would have favored Jacob. Because I was like, that's the one that God's going to choose. She knew it. And she manipulated events. I mean, she was in the wrong with her trickery. Where do you think Jacob learned all his scheming from? She's the one who came and said, hey, look, dress like this, put this on, I'll make some food he likes, go in and get your father's blessing. God allowed it to take place to accomplish what he desired. And so in the end of all of this, I think there's something to understand that at the end of Job's events, at the very end of it, it's a great verse. It's Job 42, 1 and 2. Verse 1 basically means is not much, so don't worry about that. Verse 1 is simply, then Job answered the Lord and said. But it's verse 2. After everything Job went through, after everything that had happened, his conclusion of his matter is this: I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. I think the NIV translates that as, and no plan of yours can be thwarted. That if God has ordained something, that everything that takes place, even when wickedness is arriving and evil seems to be gaining ground and doing all this, it ultimately will be used to bring about what God had set in motion in the first place. And God's perfect sovereign will be accomplished. And so when we go through those hard times, when we go through those difficult times, and we see all this wickedness happening, in the end we can claim a verse like, all things work together for good, because it's within his sovereign hand. And that is where our faith lies. That no matter what happens, that God's will be accomplished. All right, that brings us to the time frame of where we're at, and I'd like to give a chance for feedback and for discussion. Gives a chance for those online. They can write in their comments. Just a reminder for those in person, anything you say will be on the feed and will be kept there. So if you're like, I want to save my question for later, that's fine. That's the privilege you get coming in person. But give you a chance now for any comments, questions, discussion, that kind of thing for the moment.
My way to reconcile this has always been that God doesn't create us with the intention for us to do the sin, but with the knowledge that we're going to do the sin. And that knowledge doesn't taint his action.
Nope.
If it was us, that would taint our action. And that, again, shows God's divineness over our flaws, is that he could pick a Judas and treat him with equality to the other 11 disciples, and we couldn't. And so therefore we would do, by our actions or inactions, Judas to his role. And Jesus didn't doom him to it, he allowed him to do it. It's a big thought to get over.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that is something that shows Jesus' divinity. Unfortunately, this is where the Bible miniseries went really bad on it. They had it so that Jesus apparently didn't know that Judas was going to betray him until the Last Supper. But the scriptures clearly show, like John 6, Jesus clearly says, have I not chosen you, the 12? And then he goes, except one of you, you're the devil. He knew which one it was. I think there was a Saturday Night Live skit years ago. This one's actually pretty funny. It's one of the few I watched. Where it does like a kind of a Terminator thing, where the Terminator goes back in time to Jesus' time, and he keeps trying to kill Judas to get rid of Judas. And he's talking to Jesus he's going to betray you. He's like, I know. It's like, and every time it's like, it does humor in it, but he's like he kills Judas, and Jesus raises him. He's like, stop killing Judas. It's like he's got a purpose. He's like, I know this. And that is something that shows the divinity of Christ. You're right. Because if we knew ahead of time who was going to betray us, what you think is, if you gather friends together and you knew that this one friend, that a time's going to come, they're going to do you such wrong that they're going to harm you, our first thing would be like, I'm cutting you out. I don't want you here. I don't want to go through that. And Jesus is like, no, I'm going to give you. And when he did everything, you got to think he did everything with him. He gave him the ability to do ministry. He sent him out on the ministry. He answered his questions, allowed him all the privileges, and knowing that Judas was going to betray him. And he still showed his love and compassion to him.
And Judas, therefore, has no one to blame but himself.
That's correct. Yep. With that, I'll say a farewell to our online audience. As always, I thank you for joining me. As always, if you run into other questions, always don't be afraid to get them to me. You can do it through email, through message, telephone call, stop in the office. All things are great, and it's great to be with you. Just a reminder of things that are upcoming. For the most part, this week is a regular scheduled week with our kids club on Tuesday night. Our Wednesday small group, please take note that if you're in the Wednesday small group, you're meeting this week at 6 o'clock because you have your monthly potluck happening. Thursday's small group here at the church, 9:30, as you continue to go through the book of John. And our youth on Friday nights at 6:30 for grades 6 and up. And then the other one I want to note, which advertisements will come out soon, December 1st will be our Christmas kickoff. Come on out to that. So evening time, 6 o'clock on December 1st will be a Christmas kickoff. We'll have a concert, some singing together, some sharing together. So come on out on that. Mark that on your calendars. So until we're together again, may you continue to walk in the faith of Christ, grow in his knowledge, and may your trust be in him in all things. May his blessing be with you. Until next time.